Right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our weekly call. As you hopefully heard on your devices, we are now recording, so do bear that in mind. Been quite an eventful week, one way or another, not necessarily in a good way. Yeah, in terms of our call this week, as you're all hopefully aware, it's the primary focus of the call today is DNS-over-QUIC. We were going to cover two presentations, but one of those by Andrei Meshkov from AdGuard, we've pushed back probably to the end of next month, the 28th of March. Andrei felt that the timing wasn't right, given that I think a good number of the AdGuard team are either located in or certainly from Moscow and surrounding areas. So he wasn't comfortable that it was the right thing to be doing this week. But we will nevertheless focus primarily on DNS-over-QUIC. So this time around we'll focus on a paper which was presented by a number of researchers, mainly from the Technical University of Munich, as well as the CISPA Helmholtz Center for Information Security, both in Germany. So we'll do that first and then pick up on a number of other items. So with that in mind, at least one of the authors of the paper is here, possibly, I think maybe more than one, but Mike is with us. So I'll hand over to Mike and any of his co-authors, if they're on, who can sort of take us through the paper, some of the sort of key findings, and then we'll pick up on questions. So Mike, welcome, thanks for joining, and over to you.
All right, thanks, Andrew. So checking if my screen sharing works. Do you see a macOS screen? Okay, perfect.
Let's come up.
All right. So I won't be able to view the chat via the presentation. So if you have any questions, feel free to just interrupt me and ask a question. Or if anything is wrong with the audio with the video, just interrupt me, please. Okay. So thanks for having us today. And I'm Mike. I'm from Technical University of Munich, and I'm here to talk about our paper on DNS-over-QUIC, a first look. And with me today here is Viet, also from TUM, and this is collaborative work with Viber from CISPA. And this is work which is accepted at the Passive and Active Measurement Conference, which will be held at the end of next month. So just briefly, DNS-over-QUIC, what is QUIC? QUIC is a reliable encrypted transport using UDP as a substrate. And the main feature here is that it combines the connection and the encryption into 0 or 1 RTT handshakes. And it offers some improvements over TCP, like stream multiplexing, and it solves with this head-of-line blocking. And with DNS-over-QUIC, it's essentially DNS-over-QUIC, and it has been in standardization since 2020. We have around 10 draft versions. We have a lot of experimental implementations for client servers, multi-purpose libraries. However, until our study, there was no study focusing on DNS-over-QUIC, and this is what we did. And we have two parts today. First part is the adoption on resolvers worldwide, and the second one is on response times. So starting with the adoption, we performed weekly scans of the IPv4 address space from a single vantage point at our university in Munich. And we also scanned for DNS over UDP as a baseline, but of course we were targeting DNS-over-QUIC. And for DNS-over-QUIC, we used the DOQ versions draft 06 to draft 00. And for QUIC, we included the versions 1 and then 3 draft versions. So QUIC was standardized about a year ago with its version 1. However, the QUIC stacks, which are used in not only DNS-over-QUIC, but also QUIC itself, are often using draft versions. So this is why we included those versions here. And as for the metrics, we looked at the negotiated DNS-over-QUIC and the QUIC version, and the common names of the X509 certificates, which were offered by the resolvers. So for our findings, we have a plot here, and just on the macro view, what we can see here in our 29 weeks of our adoption measurements, which were started in week 27 of 2021, we see that we have a slow but steady increase by around 46% to 1,217 resolvers in week number 3 of this year here. And we also see a high fluctuation. So of the resolvers which were found in the first week, only 52% are still reachable in the last week of our measurement study. And this is quite interesting to also put this in perspective with DNS over UDP. So for DNS over UDP, we found around 290 million resolvers, and around 97% of them were still online in the last week of the measurement. In total, we observed 7 DNS over QUIC and QUIC version pairs here, and which is clearly dominated by the dark blue bars with QUIC DNS over QUIC version 2 and QUIC version 1 here. And you might notice, okay, those dark blue bars are starting in week 42 and week 43 at the earliest, and this is just why we added support for QUIC version 1 in this week. Another interesting point here is the steep increase of the usage of DNS over QUIC draft 2 and QUIC version 1 in those weeks 51 to week 1 here in 2022. And while we analyzed this, we found that this is due to a change in the open source DNS server implementation of Edgard Home. So the folks of Edgard changed the default from QUIC draft 34 to QUIC version 1 in week 51. And we also could verify this by looking at the common names of the X509 certificates. So for example, there are domains like edgard.something.something, and this is a clear hint here that the open source Edgard server is in use. But Edgard not only has their open source software, they also operate a public DNS service. And of them, we find around 25 resolvers here in the last week of our measurement study, identified by the common names dns.edgard.com and edgard.ch. And they are also the only ones highlighted here in yellow who offer DNS over QUIC draft 3 and QUIC version 1. So next up, we have the response times. And for our response times, we performed hourly measurements over the course of week 3 in 2022, here also from a single vantage point at Munich. And we used the list of IPv4 addresses from the adoption scans as our measurement targets. And we performed this as a single query per protocol. So we established the connection with the resolver. We sent the DNS query, we get the DNS answer back, and then we closed the connection. And it's important to note here that we introduce a location bias by only scanning from Munich. So the expectation is here, the farther away a resolver is, the higher the response time is supposed to be. And this is why we not only measure DNS over QUIC, but also did a comparative measurement to DNS over UDP, TCP, DNS over TLS, HTTPS, and DNS over QUIC. And we altogether found 246 resolvers which support all of those DNS protocols. We then performed 2 subsequent queries. So the first one is a so-called cache warming query, where we made sure that the cache is populated by the domain we like to query. And this is just to rule out any authoritative server lookups here, so that we just measure the part from the stub resolver to the recursive resolver in the actual measurement. We have a few different metrics here. So the first is the handshake time, which includes the time for the establishment of the transport connection, as well as the handshake of the encryption. And then we have the resolve time, which is the time to send a DNS query until the answer comes back. And the sum of both is the total time it takes to look up a name, so the response time. We also have another metric here, which is the protocol-specific RTT. So what we wanted to make sure is that the path is actually not influencing the response time measurements depending on the protocol. So it might be that, for example, TCP will get preferred on a path, or UDP will get preferred on a path, and we made sure to check this as well. Starting here with the resolve time and the RTT. So first of all, what are the expectations? The resolve time, as said, is just sending the query and getting an answer back. And this should roughly resemble one RTT as well as the RTT itself. And if we look at the CDF here of the resolve time on the y-axis, we can see that all protocols nicely overlap. So what we find here is that the resolve times independent of the protocol are identical. Moreover, if we look at the protocol-specific RTT here in the subplot, we have the RTT on the y-axis. We also find that all protocols overlap, so we can also conclude that there are no protocol-specific path influences. And if we would actually overlay those two graphs, we would see that they nicely match up. So we confirm that the resolve times and RTTs are identical and take one RTT. And next up, we have the handshake time, and here is where things get interesting. So for DNS over UDP, we have no handshake time as DNS over UDP is connectionless. For DNS over TCP, this is expected to resemble one RTT, so just the TCP three-way handshake here. For dot and do, it is expected to have two RTTs if TLS 1.3 is in use, so the TCP handshake plus the added TLS handshake. And for DNS-over-QUIC, as it combines the transport and the encryption handshake, it should resemble one RTT. And if we look at the results of the handshake time here plotted on the y-axis, we can see a rather interesting distribution in the CDF. So first of all, we have on the left-hand side here, the green bar, which is DNS over TCP, who comes up the fastest. And then we have here to the right-hand side an overlay of dot and do, which are the slowest resolvers. And somewhere in between, we have DNS over QUIC. So we observe that DNS over QUIC falls short of DNS over TCP, but it improves on DNS over TLS and HTTPS. And what we can do now is, while we measured the path-specific RTT beforehand, we can calculate the actual handshake to RTT ratio. So the time in terms of RTTs it takes for the handshake to complete. And this is shown here in the subplot, where we have the RTT ratio, the RTTs here on the y-axis. And if we start again for DNS over TCP, which is the green line here, we see that it nicely aligns with one RTT, so exactly what we expected. If we now look at DNS over TLS and HTTPS, we have an overlay here again, where they are aligning to the two RTT around about the median, and starting the median, we have a longer tail, so it is somewhat confirmed. However, from DNS over QUIC, we see that around 20% align with one RTT. Then we have around 40% with more or less mixed results. And the last 40% are also showing a very long tail here, starting with two RTTs. So this is certainly not what we would have expected. So looking into this issue, we had a look at DNS over QUIC for sure, as well as on QUIC and the QUIC standards. And we found a QUIC feature called client address validation, which is to prevent traffic amplification attacks. And this is actually handled by three different mechanisms, or three different mechanisms can be used by servers to use this feature, which are all optional. And those features are stated here. So the server can validate a client's address by receiving a packet protected with a handshake key. And this implicitly means that one RTT is added to a transport handshake. It can also be address validated with a so-called retry packet in response to a client's initial packet. This also would add one RTT. However, there's a third option where a client can reuse a token of a previous session in the subsequent session in the initial packet. And this would actually add no additional RTT here. And while we were aware of this, we actually reused the token, which was issued in the cache warming query in the subsequent initial packet. So to our understanding, the client address validation is fulfilled. However, what we could observe is that the handshake is still limited by the traffic amplification limit. And looking into this, we saw that the server or the resolver actually stops sending if 3 times the amount of data received by the client is reached. And while this is typically during the process of delivering the X509 certificate, depending on the size of the certificate either fits into this limit or it exceeds it. And if it fits, everything is fine. We have no additional RTT, but if not, we have one RTT added here, which leads to the 2 RTT handshakes we observed. And this is actually not specific to DNS-over-QUIC, but it's a quick implementation bug. So of course, we have some limitations and also future work here. First of all, the already mentioned single vantage point at our university, which introduces a location bias. We are currently working on doing this measurement in a distributed fashion on servers worldwide. And then we have the problem that DNS-over-QUIC resolvers might require SNI. And this is, for example, enforced by Google. So if you query 8888 and don't mention google.com in the SNI extension, then you won't get an answer and your connection will be denied. However, this is not something we can fix while we do not know the domain which we would like to connect to when we just connect to a IP address. Also, TLS session resumption is a feature we would like to implement in the future, which actually would solve the certificate problem, which I showed on the last slide. While using TLS session resumption, the server must not send the server certificate again, and thus the behavior would be fixed. Also interesting is TLS early data, also known as zero RTT. So with this feature, a DNS-over-QUIC request could just issue the DNS query with the first flight and get also an answer with the first flight. So essentially making this as fast as UDP, at least theoretical. As a conclusion, for our adoption, we see those week-over-week preparations, and those reflect the rapidly changing implementation in services. And for our response times, we saw that QUIC's potential is fully utilized only in 20% of measurements and around 40% of measurements. We see those considerably higher handshake times, which are due to the traffic amplification limit, despite the successful validation of the client's address. And despite this still unused potential, DNS-over-QUIC already outperforms DOT as well as DOH. And this is while if you would like to use encrypted DNS to date, then DOQ is surely the best choice to do this. So thank you for your attention. Please have a look at our paper, have a look at our code and data set, which is open source available. And I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mike. That was very helpful and a very rapid run through some of the key points. I know we've got a number of very knowledgeable people when it comes to QUIC and probably equally a DNS-over-QUIC, because we've got one of the authors of the standard on the call. So let's open it up for questions. If you want to sort of raise a question, if you're somewhere where you can't easily talk, by all means post a question into the chat and I'll read it out. Alternately, if you use the Zoom facility to raise your virtual hand, and then I'll come to you that way. Whilst we're talking, I'll also post a link to the paper in the chat as well, in case the QR code isn't easy for you to access. Who would like to ask a question? Already make an observation. Sarah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yes.
Yeah, excellent, thanks. First of all, I wanted to say thank you very much for doing this work and for kickstarting measurements of the deployment of DNS-over-QUIC in the wild, as it were. I had a couple of comments. The first one was, I was wondering, are you able to say anything at all about who you think is running services apart from AdGuard? I understand the limitation of some of them requiring an SNI, but is there anything else that you can point to as to the majority of these servers who might be operating them?
Yes, so this was rather short here in this presentation. I briefly brought back us to the slide of the adoption. And what we also find was that another public DNS resolver is NextDNS, and NextDNS operates around 200 of the found resolvers here per week. So a vast majority here is from nextdns.io.
Right, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then they're the only two sort of major players that you see at the moment.
Yes. So we have looked at AS distribution, and we have looked at the common names of the certificates, and the ones we were 100% able to attribute are AdGuard and NextDNS, and we find that a lot of common names are used only 1 or 2 times. So we have no real third place here in terms of who is operating those servers.
Yeah, fair enough. And if I'm reading this slide correctly, most of these servers are operating using the earlier versions of the doc draft. So they're using the version that doesn't prepend a length to the messages. Is that correct?
Yes, so we only find versions 00, 02, and 03. Yes.
Right, okay. So that's interesting. So hopefully that will be something that you'll see evolve if you do some future measurements, that they start picking up the later version of that spec. And as the last one, I know you had some interaction with Christian Hoytmeyer on the deprive list over this. But yeah, the question of supporting session resumption and therefore zero RTT is a very critical one. Yeah, and if you're able to modify your methodology to include that, I think you'd see quite radically different. I hope you would see much improved results and get much more towards the improved optimization that we think QUIC can deliver us. So it would be great if you can push this work further. It'd be really, really useful.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Thanks again for your work on this.
Sure. Maybe one comment on the session resumption part. Yes, this is a major drawback here. Currently, we are working on the implementation, and we would like to include this in a future measurement study. Yeah.
Yeah, I think particularly for people who are looking at this protocol, thinking about it operating between recursive DNS and authoritative DNS servers. The specification specifically provides latitude to use session resumption in that scenario to optimize your handshake. So providing data that can support that can actually be done effectively would be very helpful. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And I suppose, even without that optimization, as per your conclusions, Mike, the fact is it's already the best performing encrypted DNS protocol. So that's without the optimization. So that's an encouraging start, certainly. I see that Kevin has posted a question in the chat, really asking whether DOQ is supported in any major browsers or operating systems yet. I'm not aware that it is. I think AdGuard are one of the few providing client software. I don't know, sort of, Mike, if you and the team came across any other client software or operating system support during your work at all.
So we researched this especially in browsers, and at least of 2 or 3 months ago, we didn't find any implementation in browsers, even not a pre-flight version like Chrome is doing. So what we find was a lot of server and client software out there in the wild. So mainly also driven by AdGuard, but also a few other people, but no implementation in browser or OS yet.
That's what I thought. Thanks. And whilst I'm thinking, since you mentioned the AdGuard and Next DNS supporting DOQ, I can see John is on the call. I don't know, putting you on the spot, John, but I don't know whether you got any plans within Quad 9 to support doc at this stage, or is it too early at the moment for you?
We are watching with great interest. So it's clearly something that I think everyone's interested in, and the availability of the protocol in freely available stacks, like as a proxy, is interesting. But I think in the long term, we're looking for how this gets implemented in the main open source resolver platforms as a guidance as well.
Yeah,
chicken and egg as
usual.
Maybe a comment here also to Sarah's earlier question. So what we also did was we checked our targets we found with the list of IP addresses of well-known public DNS resolvers like Quad 9, Quad A, Quad 8, Quad 8844, and stuff like this. And we didn't find any match here. So just on the point of if we could see who is operating those resolvers. So we couldn't find next to Next DNS and AdGuard. We could not identify any other companies or operators.
Yeah. I suppose it is still relatively early days with the protocol, so it's maybe not surprising, but good that you looked. Does anyone else have any sort of questions for Mike or comments based on the sort of presentation and the paper? And I have posted a link in the chat to the paper in the meantime, by the way, so give a chance for any other questions people may have. Silence is not at the moment, in which case let's sort of draw a line there. But if you haven't had a chance to look at the paper, I think it's well worth your while looking at it, because inevitably Mike had to sort of run through it at pace the material. Did a fantastic job with that, but the paper, I think it's worth reading. And if you're happy, Mike, to share the slides afterwards, if you with me, I'll be in turn happy to share those with others if that's all right.
Sure thing.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for your time and for the paper. And I guess we'll look forward to an update when you've had a chance to look at the optimization.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. Right. Let's move on then. So with that in mind, I'll just highlight a couple of other so a couple of sort of developments over the last week, which may be of interest to people. So I'll just put those on the screen for you. So just a couple really to highlight from the last week. One is been some stories in the press over the last week that with a slight change of plan, Android 13 won't support DOE as previously planned, or depending on the nuance in the coverage, at least won't support it by default. The analysis did very little between different coverage, but which does seem to be a change, because I think as recently as the back end of last year, the signals seem to be that Tiramisu would indeed support DOE alongside DOT, but there's at least now a question mark over that. So that's just one of the stories that caught my eye over the last week. The other one, not so much a sort of headline in the normal sense, but if you didn't get a chance to join DNS-over-QUIC last week, Jeff Huston was rather helpfully written up his thoughts on sessions that he found to be of interest, and you'll excuse me, you'll see a link in the slides to a post he put on the AppNIC site a few days back. So that's a pretty time efficient way of just catching up with some of the content on DNS-over-QUIC if you weren't able to join the session live last week. The other thing just worth highlighting as well is as we're practically in March already, this time next week it will be the end of the ITF 113 standard rate. So if you're planning to register, you've got a week before the standard rate expires, and it moves on to, I think it's an extra $50 if I remember rightly, if you haven't already registered and plan to do so. So do bear that in mind. The cutoff is coming up soon. And speaking of cutoffs, the other thing I probably should have put on there is if you're planning to submit an internet draft, the cutoff for that is also 23:59 UTC next Monday. So the standard rate coming to an end and submission deadline looming this time next week. So do bear that in mind. And then just to give you a quick heads up, things that we're going to cover over the next few weeks, just following up on the discussion last week with Kenji, we're going to continue that next Monday at the early time of 10 AM UTC, when we're going to talk about support for encrypted client hello within the Chrome browser. So reminder, that'll be 10 AM UTC rather than the usual time, given that Kenji resides in Tokyo, and we'll work through the outstanding questions that we timed out with on the call last week, but almost all of them focused on ECH. And then sort of going forward from there, I think the following week we'll likely mainly be talking about some of the key sessions on the agenda for ITF 113, which is the reason why there won't be a call the following week, because I think a number of us will either be at the sessions in Vienna or at least attending virtually. And if you're planning to be in Vienna, it'd be good to maybe see a few people in person for a change. It'd be a nice experience. And then at the end of the month, as I mentioned, all things being well, Andrei Meshkov will join us to talk about Agard's experiences with DOQ, which will follow nicely from the session today and also the session from a couple of weeks back with Sarah and Alison in the DOQ standard. And then things that we'll sort of cover in sort of future weeks, we will do a sort of panel discussion, just sharing some of the experiences of deployment of encrypted DNS resolvers. So those of you running resolvers that would like to be involved in that, do just drop me a line directly and I'll make sure you're included on that panel. Now, Rishab Chabra will be joining us to talk about measuring DOE performance, which would, I think, complement nicely the session that Mike's just done. Originally, Rishab was due to do that on the 14th, but he's needed to reschedule, so we're just agreeing a new date for that. And then finally, I sort of picked up a paper from some authors from the University of South Wales on a sort of general survey on DNS encryption and some of the sort of issues around malware misuse, etc. And again, we're looking to finalise a date when they're going to present that paper. So I think that will be of a general interest to people. So that's what's coming up over the next few weeks. If there are other topics you'd like to see covered, do drop me a line. Equally, if there are topics you'd like to cover yourself, do drop me a line. I'll be happy to work you into the schedule as appropriate. Okay, that's everything from me. Let me stop talking and screen sharing and just see if there's anything from anyone else from this last week or so that anyone would like to bring up. So if there is, either do put it in the chat or just sort of raise your hand and unmute, and you'll be able to sort of share as appropriate. I'll just pause to see if anybody does have anything. Maybe while you're thinking, one deadline that's coming up relatively soon, 3 weeks' time, the 22nd of March, is the DNS-over-QUIC sort of project submissions for people interested in taking advantage of the grant from the European Commission have to be submitted by the 22nd of March. So that's one that's coming up in 3 weeks' time. But Mike, you raised your hand. You want to come off mute?
Yeah, thanks. So actually, a question to you, Sarah. You mentioned in the chat that you expect that browsers would switch to DOE 3. Are there any standardization efforts in the IETF for DOE 3? So I did not find anything in the official channels or on the mailing list on this.
So technically, my understanding is that effectively already exists, because RFC 8484 is simply an encoding for DOE, beg your pardon, for DNS over HTTP. And whether that's HTTP2 or HTTP3 is actually moot in a sense, because the encoding is identical. It's just whether the HTTP is going over QUIC or TLS under the hood. So I don't think there is a standardization blocker to that move. I think it's just a question of the evolution of the transport stacks within the browsers. But that seems to me the natural place they will go, although I haven't heard any concrete announcements from browsers, but I can't imagine them switching to DNS directly over QUIC, because that will be too much big of a implementation change internally. Whereas this would be the natural evolution.
Okay, thanks.
I'm not sure if we've got anyone directly involved in sort of in browser development on the call who may wish to comment. I know we've got Tommy on the call, for example, but I think your area is more Windows than Edge. Although if you do have a view on support within Edge, by all means unmute and say so.
So no, you're correct. I work primarily within Windows and not on the Edge browser. I will say for the operating system components, we have no immediate plans for either, but at the moment we consider DOE over H3 to be a more fitting with our strategy approach over DOQ.
Interesting, thanks, Tommy. Okay, well, that's an interesting aside. Anything else anyone else wants to raise whilst we're on the call? Don't see anything in the chat, don't see any hands raised, in which case, a reminder then, if you haven't already registered for ITF 113 and you're planning to, do so by next Monday if you want to take a voluntary standard rate. And perhaps more importantly, if you've got any internet drafts in the pipeline, you've got a week to get those together and submitted. So and I'm sure there'll be a flurry over the next week, because there almost always is in the run up to one of the ITF meetings. So with that in mind, everyone, have a great week, and we'll catch up again next week. Remember, it'll be at 10 a.m. UTC with Kenji to talk about ECH support within the Chrome browser. So look forward to speaking to you then. Thanks all for your time. Have a great week.